Die Sprachübertragung beginnt jetzt. Alle Teilnehmer befinden sich im Zuhörermodus.
Hello and welcome to the Step Up webinar on intersectional feminism within the context of violence against women. I am Beverly Mtui, a WAIF intern, and I will be presenting today. I would like to thank you for taking your time to be at this webinar. The webinar session is planned to run from 10 until 11, depending on how the question and answer session goes at the end. We may even end a little before 11 a.m. I'd like to just quickly go over the agenda to let you know what we'll be discussing today. We will also go over some housekeeping rules so we can share information while keeping it organized. I will take a few minutes to introduce myself to you and then begin the presentation. First and foremost, I will be giving you an introduction into the study of intersectionality. This will be followed by a short discussion of intersectional feminism and its importance within the context of dealing with women survivors of violence, which is based on the workshop Developing an Integrated Approach to Addressing Multiple Forms of Violence Against Women, conducted by Dorbera Felnisdottir, Judith Geller, and Dorette Jones and Sumanta Roy during the 19th WAVE conference, and the ongoing work of the London-based organization IMCAN. My presentation should take about 25 minutes, after which I will take questions and comments from the audience. Going into the technical aspects. As an audience member, you're automatically muted. I will keep the muting on until the end of the presentation, after which you will be able to ask questions during the questions and answers part of the webinar. I am not able to see you even if your webcam is on, and you are not able to see me personally, but you should be able to see the PowerPoint presentation of this webinar on your screen. If you cannot see the PowerPoint, then please simply leave the webinar by clicking the X at the top right of your screen. You can join the webinar again by clicking the link in your confirmation email. An important additional aspect, this webinar is being recorded. We have a few house rules that should make the webinar enjoyable for everyone. If you have any questions during my presentation, please feel free to type them into the questions pane. I will then answer your questions at the end of my presentation. During the questions and answers part, I will not be able to unmute everyone at the same time, but I can unmute individual participants. So if you have a question or a comment, then please raise your electronic hand, and then I will invite you to give us the question or the commentary. I would like to give you a short introduction of myself. My name is Beverly Mtui, and I'm an intern at the WAVE office in Vienna, Austria. I am responsible for various social media activities, research, and assisting at campaign activities such as the 16 Days of Activism. I am also a student of transcultural communication and social and cultural anthropology with a focus on feminism at the University of Vienna. I'm looking forward to sharing my knowledge with you, as well as hearing about your opinions and your experiences. Now let's proceed with the topic of the presentation, intersectional feminism. First, I would like to give you a brief introduction into the history of intersectionality. For many decades, the intersection of different forms of discrimination has had a tremendous influence and effect on the inclusion or exclusion of minorities within societies. The formal recognition of the term intersectionality, which in itself describes this social phenomenon, can however only be traced back to the year 1889. The term intersectionality was coined in 1889 by the US American lawyer, academic scholar, and quote, pioneer of the critical race theory, Kimberly Crenshaw, to describe the complexity and multiple layers of social injustice. Throughout her research, Crenshaw focused on the overlapping of racism and sexism in the United States of America and the subsequent and analog repercussion of these two components on the concerned individual. However, it is evident that the intersection of social differences can be found within different societies and, quite frankly, all over the world. Through the intersection of racism, xenophobia, sexism, heterosexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, and classism, concerned individuals are confronted with new obstacles which are difficult to overcome. Crenshaw compares intersectionality as a quote-unquote analogy to traffic in an intersection. She explains the definition of intersectionality using the example of a black woman, but this can certainly be adapted to any kind of woman. Crenshaw writes, and I quote, "Similarly, if a black woman is harmed because she's in the intersection, her injury could result from sex discrimination or race discrimination. To create a wider perspective, we can also say if a woman with disability is harmed because she's in the intersection, her injury could result from sex discrimination or discrimination against women with disabilities." Back to Crenshaw, and I quote, "Black women can experience discrimination in ways that are both similar to and different from those experienced by white women and black women. And again, disabled women can experience discrimination in ways that are both similar to and different from those experienced by people without disabilities or even men with disabilities." Back to Crenshaw, quote, "Black women sometimes experience discrimination in ways similar to white women's experiences. Sometimes they share very similar experiences with black men, yet often they experience double discrimination, the combined effects of practices which discriminate on the basis of race and on the basis of sex." Furthermore, the intersection of two or more forms of social discrimination cannot be explained through social discrimination A or social discrimination B. To exemplify, experiencing discrimination as a lesbian woman cannot be solely referred to as an act of homophobia or an act of sexism. It has to encompass the intersection of sexuality and sex. I would now like to explain to you the meaning of intersectional feminism and inclusivity. During the 19th Wave Conference, From Backlash to Effective Response, Step Up Together for the Protection of Women and Girls from All Forms of Violence, which took place in Budapest, Hungary from the 30th of October until the 1st of November this year, a workshop entitled Developing an Integrated Approach to Addressing Multiple Forms of Violence Against Women was conducted, addressing intersectionality and intersecting forms of discrimination. To best define intersectional feminism, which is a focal point of the third wave feminism, I would like to quote Marceline Naudy, who is a board member of the Wave Network. She has represented Malta in both EU and Council of Europe negotiations, is active in the issues of race, gender, violence against women, domestic violence, and lesbian and gay rights. And in 2017, she was nominated first vice president of the GREVIO committee. In one of the workshops, she said, "We should talk about feminisms rather than just feminism, as there are different positions within feminism itself. Therefore, when addressing intersectional and inclusive feminism, we are talking about the inherent social differences women face worldwide. Intersectional feminism refers to the awareness of these social differences and the importance of integrating them into the path of gaining equality." What does that mean within the context of violence against women? There are multiple layers to providing services to women affected by violence, multiple layers to being a survivor of violence, and evidently, multiple layers to being a woman. This means that when dealing with women survivors of violence, the survivor-centric approach has to be adapted to the specific or particular needs of the concerned woman. The importance is to put the emphasis not only on how to refer to the violence that was perpetrated against her, but also on how to refer to the woman that violence was perpetrated against. It is not only advised to use a survivor-centric approach, but also a holistic approach to embrace the multiple layers of feminism. The knowledge of social differences contributes to the inclusion of all women if proper tools are implemented and trained staff is employed to adequately deal and work with these differences. Inclusivity of all women must be the aim of women's organizations and women's service providers, as well as the society as a whole. Before getting into the practical aspects and proposals when dealing with all kinds of women survivors of violence, and that includes elderly women of abuse, lesbian women of abuse, transsexual women, migrant women, women with disabilities, allow me to refer to the theory and legislation. The Istanbul Convention, which is the Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, created by the Council of Europe and entered into force in 2014, sets standards for inclusivity, stating that states must provide services to all women. Article 4, paragraph 3 of the Istanbul Convention says, quote, the implementation of the provisions of this convention by the parties, in particular measures to protect the rights of victims, shall be secured without discrimination on any ground, such as sex, gender, race, color, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, association with a national minority, property, birth, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, state of health, disability, marital status, migrant or refugee status, or other status. Furthermore, Article 2, Paragraph 2 explains, quote, parties are encouraged to apply this convention to all victims of domestic violence. Parties shall pay particular attention to women victims of gender-based violence in implementing the provisions of this convention. And lastly, Article 22, Paragraph 2, quote, parties shall provide or arrange for specialist women support services to all women victims of violence and their children. In conclusion, it is essential to provide a gendered and intersectional understanding of dealing with violence against women. Still, an important question occurs: how can legislation be implemented into reality? As mentioned before, during the 19th Wave Conference, a workshop was conducted focusing on intersectionality and intersecting forms of discrimination. Within this workshop, sharing of knowledge and best practices were at the forefront to integrate a more inclusive approach to dealing with all kinds of women and girls affected by all kinds of violence. I would like to share with you some of the focal points, ideas, and best practices that occurred during this workshop. Thobera Fjölnisdóttir from the Icelandic organization Taboo put the emphasis on the obstacles of women with disabilities. Taboo, founded in 2014, is working with disabled women to raise awareness on abuse perpetrated against women with disabilities. Moreover, it is providing disabled women with it provides disabled women with a platform to speak out and raise their voices in the private and public sphere. I would like to give you a bit of an overview of Thobera's work and intersectional and inclusive approach to dealing with women with disabilities who are survivors of violence. A 2-year research project from 2013 to 2015, financed by the Daphne funding program of the European Commission, was conducted to accumulate data and implement practical findings into the works of service providers of disabled women survivors of violence. The project was carried out in the 4 following European countries: Iceland, UK, Austria, and Germany. According to Thobera, the aim of the project was to, quote, identify good practice and develop guidelines and recommendations for specialized victim support services for disabled women survivors of violence. I would like to share with you some recommendations based on the project findings. The recommendations refer to EU policy, national policies, disabled services, and specialized victim support services. For more information, please directly refer to Thobera Fjölnisdóttir. How can we deal with the intersection of gender-based violence and violence perpetrated against women with disabilities? Part of the project was an empirical research. Through focus groups and individual interviews, women and girls with disabilities were asked about the type of violence they were exposed to, the place the violence occurred, and who the perpetrators were. As mentioned before, when dealing with violence against women, it is important to have a survivor-centric approach and therefore be aware of who the survivor and her experiences are. Hence, it is key when working in this field to proactively find an approach to interact with the survivors through, for example, such focus groups and interviews. Furthermore, staff in shelters and service providers are advised to have an open conversation free of prejudice with the woman survivor of violence. Why should we be in direct contact with the survivors? The survivor knows more about her life and her experiences. Therefore, it is utterly important to let the voice of the survivor be heard in order to use her experience as a means to combat gender-based violence through an intersectional lens. As a result of this project, it is clear that disabled women experience a different layer to abuse due to their individual circumstances. As they are dependent on individuals or agencies for assistance, they are, according to Tobera, exposed to a higher risk of violence, and it makes it even more difficult to seek support. Secondly, when looking into the specialized victim support services, it was evident within the project that most of them are established by non-disabled women for non-disabled women. As a result, these services do not provide a barrier-free access to the services, shelters, etc. Moreover, according to Tobera, a lack of knowledge about disabled women and their particular situations leave them yet again excluded from getting the help that they need. What were the results of this project? In conclusion, it is evident that disabled women need to be included more. As survivors of violence, they need to get the adequate help that they deserve. Therefore, it is utterly important for services to provide a barrier-free and facilitated access, as well as a facilitated use of language when it comes to informing about the justice system and laws that apply to the circumstances of the disabled women survivor of violence, and of course to ensure that they are included in the service provision. Access to information is a vital part of service provision. When talking about disabled women survivors of violence, information must be written in an easy language. Moreover, information should also be accessible in various other forms, such as Braille or sign language. Language is yet another substantial part of service provision. To ensure an inclusive approach, it is essential to provide information, whether that be in organizations, in centers, shelters, or via helplines, in various languages. As an example, the MA 57's 24-Stunden Frauennotruf, a women's helpline in Vienna, Austria, for women and girls who experienced or are experiencing social, physical, or psychological abuse, offers anonymous, free of charge, confidential, and 24/7 service in the following languages: German, English, Italian, French, Spanish, and Persian. If any more languages are needed to provide counseling, a women interpreter is employed to ensure that the women survivor of violence who demand help will be provided with the adequate help that they need. When working with women survivors of violence, it is important to ensure that the communication process is conducted in a sensible manner. I would like to refer to the Istanbul Convention that puts the emphasis on the importance of hiring competent interpreters in judicial proceedings. In Article 56, paragraph 1H, it says, "Parties shall take the necessary legislative or other measures to protect the rights and interests of victims, including their special needs as witnesses, at all stages of investigations and judicial proceedings, in particular by providing victims with independent and competent interpreters when victims are parties to proceedings or when they are supplying evidence." Not only in legal proceedings, but particularly in service provision, it is of great importance to work with competent and trained interpreters and translators. It is not only important how we speak about women, but also how we speak to them. Trained translators have linguistic and culture-specific competences. Particularly when dealing with migrant women survivors of violence, sensible information must be provided considering their specific culture and origin. An additional example of good practice and an aim towards inclusivity of all women lie within the framework of the European Roma Rights Center located in Budapest, Hungary. The ERRC, for short, is a, quote, international human rights law organization that fights discrimination against Roma and human rights abuse faced by the Roma community. Roma women and girls suffer from multiple forms of discrimination. Discrimination based on their ethnicity and class, more so their economic status, and gender-based discrimination. This does not only occur in society as a whole, but often even within their own community. According to Judith Geller, a lawyer at the ERRC, She was the representative of the ERRC in the 19th Wave Conference and within the workshop. According to her, it is important to recognize intersectional discrimination before courts, international and domestic bodies, and institutions. The ERRC works on strategic litigation, research, and advocacy to combat the human rights abuse of Roma women. How does the ERRC deal with violence against Roma women? The ERRC challenges institutional racism and discrimination and takes a closer look at how the state responds to a specific case, or if perhaps state actors, doctors, the health sector, or police officer contributed to the crime. Firstly, it is of great importance to be aware of the particular forms of violence Roma women encounter or are exposed to. Coercive sterilization, police violence, and trafficking are some of the various forms of violence Roma women are exposed to. One of the recommendations of Judith Geller to include inclusivity on an institutional ground was to employ Roma women in the legal department. Inclusivity and intersectional feminism are interconnected with representation. Representation of Roma women in the legal department, for example, or lesbian women, disabled women, migrant women in women's rights organizations, support services, and centers, and so on. Representation is inevitable to adequately respond to the needs of all women survivors of violence. The facilitators and also presenters of the workshop of the 19th Wave Conference, Samantha Roy and Dorette Jones from IMCAN, address within their organization violence against Black and minority ethnic women and girls at a national and international level. IMCAN is a frontline women's organization in London, England, which is led by Black and minority ethnic women for Black and minority ethnic women. They are in partnership with various organizations to, quote, improve policy and practice responses to Black and minority ethnic women and girls. According to IMCAN, and to reinforce the premise of this webinar, it is important to connect the violence perpetrated against women and girls to the particular women and girls it is perpetrated against. During the workshop, Dorette Jones and Samantha Roy have developed recommendations with the workshop participants to hopefully implement these ideas into women's rights organizations and women's support services to be more inclusive and aware of intersectionality. The various perspectives and experiences of women survivors of violence should be represented by a diverse staff and team. Moreover, trainings and projects should be conducted to not only raise awareness on intersectionality as a whole, but also on the individual obstacles migrant women survivors of violence face, disabled women survivors of violence face, lesbian women survivors of violence face, and so on. To ensure all women survivors of violence are addressed and integrated, it is advised to contact them. This can either be done through a direct approach or through cooperation between women's organizations and particular organizations that are dealing with Roma women, migrant women, and so on. To exemplify, the WAVE Network, IMCAN, and the European Women's Lobby have cooperated and are now partner organizations of the EU-UN Women Regional Program, Implementing Norms, Changing Minds, which aims at ending gender-based discrimination and violence against women in the Western Balkans and Turkey, with a particular focus on the most disadvantaged groups of women. Within this project, grassroots organizations, which are run by and for these groups of women, are key partners who inform and actively shape the outcomes and activities of this project. It is evident that cooperation and collaboration is essential in integrating women from different social locations and backgrounds into the process of combating violence against women holistically. Through various campaigns, projects, and programs, organizations who tackle social injustice should develop an active, strategic, and practical approach towards including all women. In conclusion, intersectionality encompasses the awareness and understanding of the multiple identities one woman can have. This can be achieved through training. Specialized service providers, staff, as well as member organizations must understand the issues that a disabled woman, a lesbian woman, a migrant woman, a transsexual woman is facing. Therefore, it is important to employ a diverse team that represents the identities and multiple layers of feminism and can therefore adequately respond to the needs of the particular women survivor of violence. Furthermore, the provision of multilingual support and counseling services is inevitable in reaching all women survivors of violence. Lastly, it is important to cooperate with informal networks and grassroots organizations that are by and for women survivors who are minoritized groups to fully address the particular issues they are facing, whether that be an LGBTQ organization, a network for disabled women, an organization for Roma women, and so on. The root of gender based violence is power imbalance. Men are given more power in society than women. We also need to be mindful of power imbalances within women's organizations, as well as smaller networks, and address these imbalances. During the workshop, the emphasis was put on the importance of a transparent cooperation where trust needs to be built and resources must be shared mutually in order to avoid exploitation and form appropriate relationships and partnerships. We are now nearing the end of my presentation, and I would like to leave you with a quote by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. If we aren't intersectional, some of us, the most vulnerable, are going to fall through the cracks. A holistic and survivor-centric approach, along with a power balance cooperation between NGOs, networks, and support services, shall ensure the inclusion of all women in combating gender-based violence. The presentation is now ended. Thank you for paying attention, and thank you to Thobera Fjonesdottir, Judith Gella, Samantha Roy, and Dorrit Jones for such an informative and empowering workshop. The video of this webinar will be made available in a few weeks. There will be a worksheet which summarizes the information, and I will send it out by the end of next week. Let's start with answering some questions that have been sent during the presentation. As I can tell, there are no questions. If you have a question, you can raise your electronic hand, and I'll be sure to respond to your question. If you have a question, or maybe you would like to share what's going on in your country and your organizations, or you would like to share some practices, we would appreciate that. If you come up with any questions later, feel free to email me. And um, I would like to thank you for attending my webinar. I hope to see you participate at our next upcoming webinar on December 6th, which will be the second installment of our self-care series. Thank you very much.